I never imagined that my own son Derek would try to destroy me, but that morning in my garage in Highlands Ranch changed everything. My name is John Harlan. After 3 decades serving as a detective with the Denver Police Department, I'd learned to read people, to spot deception in the smallest gestures. So when Derek slipped something into my fishing tackle box that Saturday morning, trying way too hard to act casual, every instinct I had screamed danger. What I discovered later wasn't just shocking because of what it was, but because it revealed my son's willingness to sacrifice his father to save himself. The October sun filtered through the windows of my garage as I got my gear ready for my usual fishing trip to Cherry Creek Reservoir. Those solo outings had become sacred to me since losing my wife Catherine 3 years earlier. I was organizing my equipment when Derek showed up, and right away something felt off. His shoulders were tense, his movements forced, like someone fighting internal panic while pretending everything was fine. He greeted me with fake cheerfulness, asking about my fishing plans. As he moved closer to check out my setup, I noticed his eyes kept darting toward the tackle box. His breathing got shallow, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. When he thought I wasn't looking, his hand shot quickly to his jacket pocket, pulling out something small wrapped in black tissue paper. The move was so fast that anyone without police training would have missed it. Derek placed the object deep in the main compartment of my tackle box, nestling it between my lures and weights. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds, but watching it felt like seeing a crime in slow motion. I forced myself to keep organizing my fishing line, pretending I hadn't seen a thing. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans in a gesture that seemed more about erasing evidence than just cleaning them. After making a quick excuse about heading inside, Derek disappeared into the house. I stood alone in the garage, staring at the tackle box like it had turned into something dangerous. Whatever my son had hidden in there, he clearly expected me to find it eventually, but not right away. The contradiction didn't make sense until a chilling realization hit me. He wanted me to discover it when it would be too late to do anything about it. The past few months flashed through my mind. Derek's growing desperation for money, his mood swings, the way he avoided eye contact during conversations. I'd chalked it all up to unemployment stress and lingering grief over losing Catherine. I'd explained it away because I loved him. But 30 years on the job had taught me that love can blind you to the truth, and the truth was sitting in my tackle box, wrapped in black tissue paper like an unwanted gift. The night before should have been a warning. At dinner, Derek had been unusually quiet, barely eating, his hands shaking when he reached for his water glass. Finally, he'd spoken up, telling me he was in financial trouble and needed $50,000. The amount shocked me. I told him I didn't have that kind of money in savings and asked what kind of trouble he meant. His reaction was immediate and angry. He snapped at me, asking if it mattered, insisting he was my son and I had to help him. When I pressed him about where all the money I'd been giving him for months had gone, he stood up abruptly and mentioned people who weren't patient, people who wouldn't wait for him to figure things out. Before I could get real answers, he stormed upstairs and locked himself in his room. I'd spent the rest of the evening hearing him pace overhead, occasionally talking on the phone in low, urgent tones. Now those calls took on a sinister meaning. Derek hadn't been looking for legitimate help. He'd been testing me to see if I'd hand over the money willingly. When I refused, he'd moved to Plan B. Standing in my garage, John Harlan knew I couldn't put it off any longer. My hands shook as I approached the tackle box, 3 decades of police training battling fatherly denial. The metal latches opened with the familiar clicks that used to comfort me. I lifted the top tray and found the black tissue paper Derek had carefully placed. I unwrapped it with trembling fingers, revealing a clear plastic baggie filled with white powder. I recognized it immediately as fentanyl. Even without testing, my years in evidence rooms told me exactly what I was holding. The bag was heavy, maybe 2 ounces, with a street value of $15,000 to $20,000. More than enough for intent to distribute under federal law. More than enough to ruin whatever was left of my life. I sank onto my workbench as the full weight of Derek's betrayal crashed over me. My son was an addict. All the signs I'd missed suddenly became crystal clear. The weight loss, bloodshot eyes, mood swings, trembling hands, desperate need for cash, whispered phone calls at all hours. I'd blamed it on grief and joblessness, but the truth had been right in front of me the whole time. Worse than discovering the addiction was understanding the deliberate betrayal. Derek hadn't hidden the drugs in my tackle box by accident. This was calculated. He wanted me to find the fentanyl, but not until someone else did first. He was planning to frame me. If his plan worked, I'd be arrested for drug trafficking. At 61, a federal conviction would mean spending my final years in prison, while Derek inherited everything Catherine and I had worked our whole lives to build. I thought about the promises I'd made at Catherine's deathbed to take care of our son. She'd said he was lost without her and begged me to be patient with him. I'd been patient for 3 years while Derek spiraled into addiction under my roof. Patient while he drained my savings with endless emergencies. Patient while he turned from the sweet boy Catherine raised into someone I no longer recognized. I rewrapped the fentanyl in its tissue paper, my hands steadier now as cold determination replaced the shock. Derek thought he was playing chess with someone who didn't know the rules, but he'd forgotten that his father, John Harlan, had spent 3 decades staying one step ahead of criminals. If my son wanted to play this game, he was about to learn I had moves he never saw coming. I needed to understand why Derek was doing this. I walked upstairs toward his room and heard his voice through the closed door, urgent and pleading. He was telling someone named Lucas that he just needed 1 more week, that his dad was being difficult about the money, but he was working on it. He promised that by tomorrow night, he'd have the $50,000 they'd agreed on. The conversation revealed Derek's mounting desperation. He was begging Lucas not to do anything, insisting that if something happened to him, Lucas would never get his money. After that call ended, I heard him make another, to someone named Rebecca. He told her the house loan payment was overdue, but he was getting the money tomorrow, and she wouldn't have to start foreclosure proceedings. My knees nearly buckled when I heard about a house loan and foreclosure. Derek had apparently used my home as collateral for something, and I knew nothing about it. 20 minutes later, he came out of his room dressed for a job interview, looking composed despite the panic I'd heard in his voice. He told me he was heading out and asked me to wish him luck. I waited until his car pulled out of the driveway, then I got to work. My police training had taught me how to investigate, and my own son wasn't going to outsmart me. His room revealed the full story and scattered documents he'd tried to hide. Bank statements showed massive cash withdrawals over the past 6 months. Credit card bills showed cash advances totaling $30,000, most taken at a local casino. The loan agreement I found made my hands shake. A licensed lender named Rebecca Martinez had given Derek $80,000 using my house as collateral. My signature had been forged on documents that put everything I owned at risk. I found gambling receipts stuffed in his dresser drawer, betting slips showing losses that piled up week after week, and phone numbers scribbled on scraps of paper, including one labeled "Emergency Contact for Lucas." The timeline became crystal clear. Derek had been gambling away money he didn't have. When the casino debts mounted, he'd borrowed from Rebecca Martinez, forging my signature to use the house as collateral. When that money ran out, he'd turned to Lucas Diaz for drugs, probably planning to sell them to pay off the other debts. Now both creditors were closing in, and Derek, trapped between 2 dangerous people, had decided to sacrifice his father to save himself. The framing wasn't just about getting money. It was about eliminating the only person who could stop him from losing everything I'd worked a lifetime to build. I photographed the loan documents and gambling receipts with my phone before putting them back in place. If this went to court, I'd need proof that Derek had forged my signature and stolen my house. I walked back to the garage with steady, purposeful steps. The fentanyl was exactly where I'd left it. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my palm. 2 ounces of white powder that could destroy my life, or save it, depending on where it ended up. Through the garage window, I saw Derek's old Honda Civic in the driveway, the car I'd helped him buy when he graduated college, back when I still believed he'd make something of himself. I heard the front door open and Derek's voice calling out that his car was making weird noises again and he was going to take a ride share to the interview to be safe. I told him that was smart thinking. After I heard the ride share arrive and Derek's footsteps fade down the front walkway, I found his car keys hanging on the hook by the back door, right where he always left them. The trunk opened with a soft click. Inside were jumper cables, a spare tire, and an old gym bag he hadn't used in months. I moved the gym bag aside and placed the fentanyl underneath it, nestling it against the wheel well where it would be easy to find, but not immediately visible. As I closed the trunk, I thought about what Catherine would say if she could see me now. She'd always believed in second chances, in the power of love to redeem even the worst mistakes. But Catherine had never faced a son willing to destroy his father to save himself. I put the keys back on their hook and returned to the garage. I cleaned every surface Derek might have touched, removing any trace of what had been hidden there. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years I'd been trying to save a son who was already lost. Now I was saving myself from the son I'd failed to save. Derek got home just after 6, looking more confident than I'd seen him in months. He walked through the front door with energy in his step, as if his problems had suddenly lifted. When I asked about the interview, he said it went really well, and the company seemed impressed. He thought this could be the break he'd been waiting for. I watched him carefully, noting how his eyes avoided looking toward the garage. He was performing, and it was convincing. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed him. He said he was tired and wanted to rest before dinner. I nodded and turned my attention back to the TV, but I listened to every sound from upstairs, every creak, every muffled conversation through his door. Within 20 minutes, I heard Derek's voice, urgent and excited. He was calling to report drug trafficking. He gave his name and said he had evidence that his father was dealing fentanyl. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay still. This was the moment Derek had been building toward. He gave my full name, John Harlan, and my age, said I was hiding drugs in my fishing tackle box, and that he'd seen me with a large quantity of fentanyl that morning. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the relief of someone who thought his problems were about to be solved. He gave our address, described the tackle box's location, and even provided details about my supposed criminal associates. After ending that call, he immediately dialed another and told Lucas it was done, that police were on their way to arrest his father, and he'd have the money by tomorrow. Then he made a third call to Rebecca, telling her everything was going according to plan, and that once I was arrested, he'd have access to everything and her loan would be paid in full. I sat in my living room, listening to my son orchestrate my destruction with criminal efficiency. Part of me was impressed by his thoroughness. The rest of me felt sick. 15 minutes later, I saw the first police car pull into the driveway, followed by 2 more vehicles and an unmarked sedan. Through the window, I recognized Detective Patricia Hayes, my former colleague from the Denver PD. Derek came downstairs, his face showing concerned innocence. He asked what was going on with all the police cars outside. His performance was flawless. If I hadn't overheard his calls, I might have believed his confusion was genuine. When the doorbell rang, Derek moved toward the door, but I stood up first and said I'd get it. As I walked to the front door, I caught Derek's reflection in the hallway mirror. For just a moment, when he thought I wasn't looking, his mask slipped. The expression underneath was cold, calculating, and completely without remorse. I opened the door to find Detective Patricia Hayes on my porch, flanked by 2 agents in tactical gear. Behind her, more officers were securing the property. Patricia greeted me professionally but with regret in her voice, saying we needed to talk. I invited her in. Derek stepped forward, showing worried confusion, asking if I was in trouble. Patricia explained they'd received a report of drug trafficking at this address and had a warrant to search the premises. Derek acted shocked, saying drug trafficking was impossible, and his father would never do something like that. I told him calmly to let them do their job. The lead agent stepped forward and informed me they had information I was storing fentanyl in my fishing tackle box. Derek's eyes lit up with helpful cooperation. He offered to show them exactly where the tackle box was in the garage. I followed the group, watching Derek's confidence grow. He was so sure of victory, so certain his plan was unfolding perfectly. He pointed to my tackle box and mentioned I'd been working on it that morning, acting really nervous. The agent approached with practiced caution, photographing from multiple angles before opening the latches. Derek moved closer, anticipation radiating from him. The agent lifted the top tray, revealing my organized collection of lures and sinkers. He methodically searched each compartment, removing items and examining them carefully. There was nothing there. The agent looked up, confused, saying they weren't finding any controlled substances. Derek's face went pale. He insisted it was impossible and said he'd seen me put something in there that morning. He demanded they check again. I asked him quietly what exactly he thought he'd seen. Derek's composure started cracking. He described something wrapped in black tissue paper and insisted he was sure of it. Patricia Hayes studied him with new interest, noting he seemed very certain about the contents of my tackle box, and asking why that was. Derek stammered that he was just trying to help and thought he'd seen something suspicious. After the lead agent finished examining the tackle box and confirmed there was nothing there, Patricia made a call. She told them to hold on and said they should search Derek's vehicle instead. Derek's voice cracked as he asked why they'd search his car, pointing out that he was the one who'd reported this, but the agents were already heading toward his Honda Civic. Derek followed, his confident stride replaced by nervous shuffling. The trunk opened with a soft click. The lead agent moved the gym bag and spare tire aside, then stopped. His hand came out holding a clear plastic baggie filled with white powder, wrapped in the familiar black tissue paper. Patricia's voice turned cold as steel as she arrested Derek for possession of fentanyl with intent to distribute and filing a false police report. Derek's face went through shock and panic before settling into desperate calculation. He claimed it was a setup, that I'd planted it there and was trying to frame him. Patricia asked him why, if that were true, he'd called them to search my tackle box instead of his car. As the handcuffs clicked around Derek's wrists, he looked at me with pure hatred, accusing me of moving the drugs. I met his eyes steadily and told him I had no idea what he was talking about. The look of shock on his face said it all. He'd never expected his father, John Harlan, to be the better strategist. 3 weeks later, I sat in the Denver County Courthouse watching my son face the consequences of his choices. Derek looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, the confidence that had defined him completely stripped away. The federal prosecutor laid out the case with clinical precision, describing the 2 ounces of fentanyl and its street value, the intent to distribute, the false police report, and the attempt to frame a family member. The prosecutor emphasized that Derek hadn't just possessed illegal narcotics, he'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to destroy his own father's life. Derek's court-appointed attorney cited addiction, desperation, and family trauma from losing his mother, but the evidence was overwhelming. Derek's recorded phone calls to Lucas and Rebecca had sealed his fate. When the judge asked if Derek had anything to say, my son stood slowly and apologized to me in a barely audible voice. He said he'd been desperate and made terrible choices, claiming he never meant for things to go this far. I sat in the gallery feeling nothing but emptiness. The apology felt hollow, performed for the judge rather than spoken from the heart. The judge sentenced Derek to 5 years in federal prison for drug trafficking and conspiracy. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a door slamming shut on 30 years of fatherhood. But Derek's arrest had only solved part of my problems. Rebecca Martinez still held forged documents claiming ownership of my house, and Lucas Diaz had vanished after Derek's arrest to avoid police attention. I spent weeks working with my attorney to prove the loan documents were fraudulent. The forged signature was obvious once experts examined it, and Derek's confession helped establish the timeline of the deception. My lawyer explained that the good news was fraudulent, documents were void, meaning my house had never been legally at risk. Rebecca Martinez had fled the state to avoid prosecution. Detective Hayes kept me updated on the ongoing investigation. She said they were working with federal marshals to track down both Rebecca and Lucas, and that Derek's cooperation might reduce his sentence. but he was still looking at serving at least 3 years. That meant my son would be 30 when he got out, and I'd be 64, if I lived that long. The house felt different now, emptier in ways that had nothing to do with Derek's physical absence. I walked through rooms where we'd shared meals, watched TV, and argued about responsibility. The memories felt tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal. 2 months after Derek's sentencing, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable before. I put the house on the market. When Patricia Hayes asked if I was sure about selling my home, I told her Catherine was gone, and the son I'd raised didn't exist anymore. It was time to start over. The realtor said I could expect a quick sale in Denver's hot market. I began sorting through 30 years of accumulated memories, deciding what deserved a place in my new life and what belonged to the past. Some chapters end with celebration, others with relief. This one ended with acceptance that family can betray the deepest trust, but survival means choosing your own well-being over obligation to those who would destroy you. 6 months later, John Harlan stood on the balcony of my new apartment in Boulder, Colorado, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in gold and crimson. The view was spectacular. Nothing like the suburban streets where I'd spent 30 years building a life that ultimately belonged to someone else. The house had sold in 2 weeks. After paying off the mortgage and legal fees, I had enough to buy this small place outright and start fresh with no debt, no obligations, and no family members who might betray me for their own gain. I kept only what mattered: Catherine's photographs, my fishing gear, and the hard-earned wisdom that love without boundaries becomes enabling, and enabling destroys both the giver and the receiver. Derek had written me twice from federal prison. Both letters remained unopened on my kitchen counter. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ash. Detective Hayes visited last month with updates. Lucas Diaz had been arrested in Phoenix, facing charges that would keep him locked up longer than Derek. Rebecca Martinez was still a fugitive, but her loan sharking operation had been dismantled. Patricia asked if I ever regretted how it ended. I told her I regretted that it had to end that way, but I didn't regret protecting myself from someone who would have destroyed me without hesitation. The truth was simpler than regret or forgiveness. I'd raised a son who became a stranger, loved someone who saw that love as weakness to exploit. When faced with the choice between his survival and mine, Derek chose his own. I, John Harlan, simply made the same choice. My tackle box sat in the corner, cleaned and reorganized, waiting for weekend trips to mountain lakes where the water runs clear and the fish don't lie about their intentions. Simple pleasures for a man who'd learned to value simplicity. Sometimes the people closest to us become the greatest threats to our well-being. Sometimes protecting yourself means accepting that family can be the enemy. Sometimes the hardest lesson in life is learning when to walk away from those you love most. I'd spent 61 years learning that lesson. Derek had the rest of his life to learn it too. Through this journey, we discover that authentic love requires wisdom, not just sacrifice. History teaches us that enabling harmful behavior isn't compassion, it's complicity. Families are meant to nurture growth, not shelter destruction. When betrayal happens in our own homes, we face the toughest test, choosing wisdom over emotional attachments. Stories like mine show how addiction and desperation can turn loved ones into strangers. Yet we're never abandoned in these dark valleys. Discernment helps us recognize when love has become manipulation, when family loyalty has become self-destruction. My police training wasn't just career preparation. It equipped me for this ultimate test. Tough love means drawing lines that seem harsh but preserve what matters most. When Derek chose deception over honesty, the strength to respond with justice rather than enabling was already in me. We're called to be good stewards of our own souls. Sometimes the greatest mercy is giving ourselves permission to walk away from those who would drag us into their darkness. If you've ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted completely, you know how hard it is to find the strength to protect yourself. The courage to start over comes from recognizing that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to be destroyed by those who would sacrifice you for their own salvation.